Okay. So just be aware that we are recording this because there have been a number of requests from people who couldn't be here at this event. And so we are recording this and with the permission of the panelists. So welcome to this event. Ua Mau Ke Ea, remembering Dr. Haunani-Kay Trask, a panel celebrating the life and work of Haunani-Kay Trask. And before I turn over the event to the chair of the panel, my colleague and friend, Kualoha Ho'omanawanui. I'll introduce her, of course, but I wanted to make an announcement about next week's colloquium. And Shauna Yang Ryan, another tremendous colleague of ours, is going to be doing a presentation, essentially creative work that she's working on, her sabbatical project. Anatomy, a sabbatical project is the title, and information about this will go out tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. Kualoha Ho'omanawanui is a Kanaka Oiwi scholar, poet, artist, and Kiai Aloha Aina. She's a full professor of Hawaiian literature here in the English department, specializing in traditional mo'olelo, including folklore and mythology, oceanic, Pacific literature, and indigenous perspectives on literacy. In more recent years, she has been developing Native Hawaiian literature digital humanities projects. She's a founding and the current chief editor of OIWI, a Native Hawaiian journal. She was a Ford Foundation Fellow from 2001 to, I just want to make sure that everybody is able to come in, okay. 2001 to 2005, and Mellon Hawaii postdoctoral fellow from 2009 to 2010. Kualoha has published widely, too widely for me to list all her publications, given the constraints of time. I've taught some of her essays in my post-colonial theory class with great success. I will mention her award-winning first book, Voices of Fire, Reweaving the Lay of Pele and Hi'iaka Literature, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2014. She's affiliate faculty. She's affiliate faculty with the Center for Pacific Island Studies and the Indigenous Politics program here at UHM. And Kualoha, in a way, I feel like this panel brings you, me, and Laura full circle with regard to Haunani. 20 years ago, I was privileged to facilitate a fascinating radio conversation on WBAI, New York City's Pacific affiliate. That was when I was still active with the Asia Pacific Forum on that radio station, in which you, Kualoha, and Laura interviewed and engaged Haunani. And that was one of my very first introductions to Haunani's tremendous work. And so in a way, for me personally, we're coming full circle today as we remember and celebrate the tremendous intellectual and activist legacy of Haunani-Kay Trask, who was never in the English department, but had very close links with a number of us, taught for us sometimes, and of course, was very much included in the community of the English department. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kualoha.
Mahalo nui loa Shankar, aloha awinola kako. It's a great honor for me to be here today and participate on this panel discussion on my kumu, mentor, and friend, Dr. Haunani-Kay Trask. First, I'd like to briefly introduce my fellow esteemed Manoa Wahine panelists, my dear colleagues and friends. And I'm going to keep it brief and allow them to share whatever else they would like when they speak. First, Dr. Laura Lyons, Professor of English and current Interim Vice Provost for Academic Excellence. Dr. Brandy Nalani McDougall, Associate Professor of American Studies, recently named Director of the Manoa Center of Humanities and Civic Engagement, and a recipient of a 2021 Innovation and Impact Teaching Award. And Dr. No'u Kahaole Rivilla, Assistant Professor of English, and also a 2021 winner of the National Poetry Series competition and the very first OEV poet to do so. So I am thrilled to be amongst all of you who I have known, I believe, for at least 20 years, if not longer. And it seems very fitting to me that Haunani's fighting Irish spirit and her OEV heritage is represented by our panel, and that my two OEV Wahine colleagues here are genealogically rooted to Maui, as was Haunani. So I'll start with a few remarks, and then we'll each share some of our thoughts and then open up for questions and comments at the end. And if you wouldn't mind muting.
Ku'u, you are muted.
Oh my gosh, that's so crazy. I muted myself too. Okay, as an Oiwi scholar, poet, and Kia'i Aloha Aina, my life and career has been intimately shaped by my relationship with and learning from Dr. Trask, or Haunani, as she was fine with all of us calling her, for my entire adult life, spanning 35 years at this point. I first met her as a 20-year-old undergraduate student when I enrolled in her Hawaiian Studies 343 course, Political Myths of Hawaiian History. And I was a new transfer student from Kauai Community College, where life in the big city and shifting from a campus of 2,000 to a campus of over 20,000 was quite overwhelming. When we got our first papers back, she had written in red ink across the front cover page in her scrawling handwriting, "Come see me," with about 5 exclamation points. I was terrified, thinking I had messed up somehow, and later went to her office in Moore Hall, trembling, tentatively knocking on her open door. Her desk was always in the power position, facing the door. And when she looked up from her writing, she said, "Good, you're here, come in, sit down. What's your major? What's your plans? What are you doing? Have you thought about Hawaiian studies?" I had no idea such a thing existed because there was no Hawaiian studies in my DOE high school curriculum at the time. This was coming on the mid-80s. "You're a brilliant writer and we need you," she pronounced, and then walked me down the hall holding my hand to see our academic advisor, Ekela Kaniaupio. That's how I became a Hawaiian studies major. Haunani exposed her students to activist thinkers worldwide. We read writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, Stephen Biko from across Africa. We read Native American writers like Joy Harjo, Wilma Mankiller, Winona LaDuke. We read African American writers and thinkers like Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and Toni Morrison. We read Pacific writers and thinkers and activists like Donna Avatere and Ranginui Walker in Aotearoa. She introduced me and gifted me with a book by Palestinian poet Fadwa Tuqan, who told me that was one of her favorite poets. And noticed that we didn't just read about politics and history and activism, but also literature, which was another great love of hers. And she often wove these together in our classes. We studied colonialism from Palestine to South Africa during a time when apartheid was still fully entrenched, from North Ireland to Fiji when the coups were still happening, or some of the coups at that time in the late 80s. And we studied environmental racism from Los Angeles in California to Vieques Island in Puerto Rico and beyond. These were within Hawaiian studies courses in which we were talking about Hawaiian history, culture, and politics, but she was really strategic in framing this within a dynamic global web of colonialism, of indigenous politics and activism that helped us as young thinkers and budding activists and scholars to see the much larger picture, that what was at stake across time and place and how it was all interconnected did not just affect Hawaii and Kanaka Oiwi. For me, looking back, she was critical race theory, she was indigenous politics, and she was Manawahine and much, much more before these terms were even conceptualized. And for me, she has always been at the forefront of the modern Lahui, and movement for sovereignty that galvanized everyone in the early 1990s over very public and spirited debates on sovereignty, which no one had ever seriously considered before then, and often laughed at her. I still remember that as a student, being in public places in particular, away from campus. Throughout my BA, she would consistently say to us, when you go to graduate school, this, when you go to graduate school, that. And I'd smile and nod and think, graduate school, I can't wait to go home to Kauai, get my wholesale job back and ride my horses for the rest of my life. Ha, life and Haunani had other plans. She hired me to start teaching Hawaiian Studies 107 as a graduate assistant in the spring of 1993, which was the commemoration of the overthrow, right? Spring semester starts in January. Even though I was not yet enrolled in an MA program at UH at the time. I had been home on Kauai working with the Salvation Army post-BA in Hawaiian Studies, doing relief work in the aftermath of Hurricane Eva in my home community. And only Haunani, I believe, could have found me when all the communications were down. We still had no phone communications. This is before internet. And then she asked me if I wanted to come back and teach, and I said, yes. And I was so proud of myself for that talent being recognized. And then I hung up the phone, had an anxiety attack, thinking, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't go back, I can't teach, I'm gonna let Haunani down. But because she was so fierce and brave, I couldn't imagine making that phone call and saying, I can't do it. And she would ask me why, and I would say, I'm scared. I would rather face my fear than make that phone call. And so she launched my teaching career. Haunani is the pico of my academic and activist genealogy, and I tell my students all the time that they too are part of this rich intellectual, activist, and poetic genealogy as well, as we see here with our other Oiwi Wahine panelists today. Haunani had a large, ambitious vision in starting the Center for Hawaiian Studies, one of 3 schools that made up SHAPS at the time, the School of Hawaiian, Asian, and Pacific Studies. For the first time, Hawaiian Studies wasn't just an interdisciplinary degree and strongly focused on politics, history, language, and culture. She conceptualized Kua'ana, the first OEV student services program, which I worked for as an undergraduate. And we would go to high schools to encourage Hawaiian students to come to college. We would provide academic and social support for Manoa OEV students across campus in all different disciplines. And we had an annual social event, the Kua'ana Bash, that could bring OEV students together so we could have a visible presence on campus, network with each other, and support each other because our numbers were much smaller at that time. Her vision was to grow the center by having its own building and facilities, to add graduate program, and to fill professions from law, medicine, art, education, business, and beyond, with well-trained, knowledgeable Hawaiians who could make significant inroads to the poor health, socioeconomic conditions Hawaiians faced and still do, with the ultimate goal of getting Hawaiian land back, Oiwi on our lands, and our aina and ourselves caring for each other. It is incredible to look back nearly 4 decades later and see how the seeds she planted have sprouted, matured, and blossomed. I am one of the first 13 to graduate with my BA in Hawaiian Studies under her leadership. Our first class graduated in 1991. Many of us are educators, 4 of us are UH professors across the system in different fields, including, and many others that followed as well, too many to name at this point, which is just really awesome and amazing. From English, political science, history, American studies, ethnic studies, law, women's studies, medicine, the list goes on. This doesn't even account for those who have learned from her in her campus visits, conferences, and through reading her works at universities around the world. I personally know some of her students who live and work and are community leaders from India to South Africa, from Aotearoa to Puerto Rico. Perhaps the most notable quote from Haunani's poetry many of us use is her description of her life's work as weaving a rope of resistance into baskets to carry our daughters in, and in extension, our entire lahui. This is a central, inspiring metaphor many of her students have incorporated into our teachings, our activism, and our life philosophies. The best way to honor and remember her by passing on her teachings and her desire to still strengthen and empower all of us with Ike. As the struggle is real, the struggle is long, and the struggle is hard. Yet, what underpinned her fire and tenacity for teaching was joy, a belief and practice of pilina, relationships with haumana, ohana, community, lahui, aina, which is visible across all of her work in her scholarship and her poetry, in her interacting with and mentoring her students, in her friendships and her professional relationships. I have always been in awe and still am of her brilliance and fearlessness in taking on sexist and misogynistic Hawaiian men in the movement. And one of my favorite personal quotes that I say all the time now, that she would say, if you want to know why I'm not with a Hawaiian man, ask a Hawaiian man. To racist UH administrators and even students, such as the Joey Carter incident, and even the racist local media. Funny, Bob Jones just raised his ugly head today, opining incorrectly on Mauna Kea. She saw it all as teaching moments for her students, training us in nonviolent actions, marching down to the Star Advertiser offices to demand meetings with editors, protesting outside the legislature and the governor's mansion, occupying Bachman Hall, and literally blocking UH's initial plan to put the Hawaiian Studies building in the Kanewai Lo'i and replacing the Lo'i. Very ironic, since the Lo'i is a central image and symbol of Aloha Aina in Hawaiian culture, and ironic since our current administration calls us, quote unquote, an Aloha Aina University. Aside from large visible actions that transformed Hawaiian politics and activism between the 1980s and 1990s, culminating with the centennial commemoration of the overthrow in 1993, which saw the publication of the first edition of From a Native Daughter, which UH Press had rejected, to the release of the documentary she co-produced, An Act of War, I cannot imagine the Lahui today and the continued vibrant Aloha Aina activism from Mauna Kea to Kauai without her leadership and immeasurable influence. And Hawaii is only the pico of such. After her passing was announced earlier in the summer, an outpouring of gratitude from around the world on social media demonstrated just how much Haunani has influenced so many. This panel is but one small tribute of many that have already occurred and many which are yet to come. I am pleased to announce that I was recently invited, along with Dr. Noi Goodyear-Ka'opua, to co-edit a special issue of the American Indian Research Journal at UCLA that will honor Haunani. As an editor of Uiwi, a Native Hawaiian journal, we are also working on a special issue that we're dedicating to her because she is someone who helped us found the journal back in 1997. Haunani's mentorship and influence on her students was vast and profound and continues to this day. Not only in the classroom or in community activism, but in small, more personal ways where she cultivated our na'au, reminding us to celebrate life. She would invite students for football watch parties at her beautiful He'eia home to cheer on her beloved Green Bay Packers since she went to graduate school in Wisconsin. She would once canceled our class to head to Campus Center to go and hear the rap group Public Enemy speak and became really good friends with Chuck D after that. It was common to order rounds of Prosecco for late night post-poetry reading stops at Hautree Lanai, where they always had a table ready for her, or down in Chinatown at Duke's Bistro. And when my former husband Iwani and I were married, she wrote us a very large and generous check as a wedding gift. and allowed us to hold our wedding as the very first event in the brand new Hawaiian Studies building back in 1996. But then told me as she handed over the check, you know, Ku'aloha, I don't believe in marriage. It's so patriarchal, so I'm not coming but here. And helped us 2 broke graduate students to pay for it. For years, we were neighbors in He'eia, where I still live, and we often picked her up and drove her to campus. At the time, my 3-year-old nephew, Lucas, would sit on her lap as she, Lucas, Iwani, and I all squeezed into the tiny single cab of my little red Mazda truck. And as we drove down Kamehameha Highway to drop Lucas off at preschool, she would play This Little Piggy with Lucas, but her own version, which goes something like this. This little piggy went surfing. This little piggy stayed home. This little piggy ate lau lau, and this little piggy went ku-e, ku-e, ku-e all the way home. Womau ke'ea o ka'aina i kapono. The life, the sovereignty of the land, that which feeds, nurtures, and sustains all life, continues when justice prevails. That's my translation. Womau ke'ea, the life, the works, aloha aina continues as we nana mau ke kaula ku'e a ho'omau I ke aloha aina. We continue to weave the rope of resistance that is also an insistence of aloha aina, which is the piko, the iwihilo, the kahua, the center, the core of one's being, the foundation of the life, teaching, and continued impact of Kumu Haunani-Kay Trask. I'd like to end reading a passage from her essay on the Hawaiian monk seal that was published in 1998 that speaks to the breadth of her Aloha Aina advocacy. It was written in 1996, and like all of her work, it's prescient and still relevant, especially in this time of noticeable climate change ravaging the Pacific. In 1996, she had interviewed Tim Reagan, a scientist working to preserve the Hawaiian monk seals. So quote, this is Haunani's writing. I asked Mr. Reagan if anything could be done to revive the monk seal. He answered that there are some signs of recovery in certain populations in the Northwest Islands. He mentioned other species like the Guadalupe fur seal have come back from the brink of extinction. Possibly such recovery may occur for the Hawaiian monk seal. Despite his reassuring comparisons, Mr. Reagan didn't seem a believer. I asked whether he thought humans should be kept away from the monk seals, including military men, fishermen, tourists, even Native Hawaiians, all of us human beings. He replied, the only way to save some ecosystems is to make them off limits to everyone completely. I think of our ancient kapu system where careful restrictions preserve the land and her bounty. Scientists such as Tim Reagan trying to enforce modern kapu. But predation rather than conservation drives the engine of the world now. I look again at the photograph of a monk seal tangled in nets. I think of the state of the earth, our mother, of our people, her children, of myself, her native daughter. I think of the only monk seal I have ever seen in captivity, of course, like myself, like our people and lands in captivity. Nature in captivity, in human captivity, a perversion of the natural order. I think of what we must do as a species. I doubt we will have the will to do it. But some of us already use our lives in trying to stop predation to restore the natural order. What else can we do? Heartened by this tender resolution, I look out from my writing table to the comforting wetlands beyond. The sky is a blowing mass of darkening clouds. Beyond the fertile lava crevices of the Ko'olau Mountains, a dying sun fades away. Just now, great billows of rain refresh the earth, releasing the cool smelling mud of mango and breadfruit trees. A cleansed moment, a nourishing feeling. I lean back and ponder the coming beauty of night. I share these words from just up the road in Hei'uli today, from where Haunani first wrote them, surrounded by the same kaniko'o rain, looking at the same crevice Ko'olau cliffs. Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ke aloha a me ka pono. Aloha. I'd like to turn it over to Laura.
Thank you. Aloha and mahalo to Shankar and Kualoha for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's really a tremendous honor to be with all of you today, and I'm really, truly grateful for this event. I think one of the many horrendous things about COVID has been the way the kind of isolation it can impose upon us, especially in times of mourning. And I know that many of you have had a chance either in impromptu ways or in planned ways to get together with others to celebrate Haunani's remarkable life, but I haven't, and I'm really grateful for this chance to do so. It's been hard to kind of think about this grief. And I want to acknowledge that the size of the loss for others is truly the size of a nation. I often tell job candidates that are not from here that this place will give you so much more than you could ever hope to give it. And one of the amazing things that it gave me was a friendship with Haunani. So we often mark friendship right by years, but when I think of Haunani, I think of the many lei, bottles of Prosecco, and books, frequently of poetry given and received between us, and shared among others, particularly Christina Bakilega, Cynthia Franklin, Candace Fujikani, and Eiko and Karen Kosasa. She had many friendships in this department, and I think what I felt like I could contribute from my position as a non-Hawaiian and someone who's been in the department a while is to try and write about about those friendships, including my own. So I hope this helps people understand something both about the women I'm going to speak about, but also about the English department. In terms of timing, it seems to me that this event is also a fitting one to follow last week's discussion, Decolonizing the English Department, What Does It Mean? Which I am really sorry I wasn't able to attend. If following Patrick Wolf, settler colonialism is to be understood as a structure, not an event, how much longer the work, both arduous but also sometimes joyous, in undoing those structures? What is needed now is significant, but I also want us to remember that it has been this department's willingness to think about our history, to commit to a different vision of a future that allowed Haunani to find a refuge at a particularly tumultuous point in the department, a place to teach two of the things that she dearly loved, poetry and politics. Lots of people are responsible for the department's commitment to prioritizing Hawaiian and the Pacific in our curriculum and in our hiring, but no one more so than Christina Bakilega, whose time as chair more strongly set us on a decolonizing course. Haunani often mentioned how pivotal Christina was to getting UH Press to issue the expanded version of From a Native Daughter in 1998. Their connections, of course, exceed that and are for Christina to speak to, but Haunani loved Italy, its food, its films. She once lent me this enormous tome of Pasolini's writings, its political thought, especially that of Antonio Gramsci, which, and I know some of you know that we had a reading group around Antonio Gramsci. I started here in fall 1993, which was the 100th anniversary of the overthrow. At the end of my dissertation defense in July, the dissertation group that I was a part of gifted me with this copy of From a Native Daughter. It's the original one that was published from Common Courage Press, and they all wrote messages to me in it. It's now very worn, and the cellophane is coming unglued, and it isn't the one that I teach from because the expanded edition has so much in it, but it is the one that is close to my heart because it helped me to understand my place here. It helped me to orient myself and to navigate many of the things that I encountered. In fall 1993, she and David Stannard were in Colorado, so I didn't get to meet her that year. I met her in fall 1994 when I asked her if I could interview her for the Sinn Féin Women's magazine. So in case you don't know, Sinn Féin is a nationalist party on both sides of the border that separate the 6 counties of the north of Ireland from the 26 counties that make up the Republic of Ireland. As I was, she agreed, and as I was on my way to her office, I ran in, which was then in Moore Hall, I ran into Lorene Despain and told her where I was going. Lorene said, when she finds out that we hired a white woman to teach post-colonial literature, she will eat you for lunch, which was a little foreboding, to say the least. But it should be noted that nothing was farther from the truth. In fact, Haunani could care less about a term like post-colonial literature, which was a good thing for me because the program that Shankar and I went to also really didn't particularly care for the term post-colonial, right? What she did care about was Ireland. And she told me about her Irish heritage, how she was descended from the O'Neills, which are one of the 4 original chieftains of Ireland, and that she saw this as a dual heritage of resistance. We had a long talk. Ultimately, for many reasons, the interview was not published. But when I was leaving, she asked me, would you be willing to testify for Native Hawaiian students to receive tuition waivers? And I agreed. Recently, over the summer, I went through all the emails I had related to Haunani. And one of the things I noticed was how many letters over the years I wrote either for her to receive awards or that Cindy and I wrote in opposition to all kinds of things that were happening on campus. Many of these letters were responding to the latest, usually white, usually male, usually not from here student to discover Haunani's work, and who was intent on decrying loudly and ignorantly how unfair, even violent, her positions were to them personally. Cindy and I wrote a number of these, and I want to say like Christina, Cindy was a friend and supporter of Haunani. I think Haunani would admire Cindy's work on Palestine and deeply appreciate the ways that Cindy has been responsible for drawing out and bringing in people who can connect in concrete, material ways, the connection between settler colonialism in Palestine and in Hawaii. On the back cover of this 1993 edition of From a Native Daughter is a quote from the New York Times, which reads, like Hawaii's volcano Kilauea, Trask sets off explosions. Well, we could unpack that statement if we had a lot of time, but we don't. One of the explosions that she set off was most certainly her 1997 plenary address at the Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the United States Conference, MELIS. Sometimes Cindy would refer to it as Hellas MELIS, co-organized by Ruth Shue and Cindy Franklin. Her plenary address was entitled, Writing in Captivity, Poetry in a Time of Decolonization. Among other things, it offered a hard-hitting indictment of settler colonialism and those complicit with it. It shocked some participants, outraged others who read it as anti-immigrant, and inspired the work of a new generation of scholars and poets. Both Haole and Asians, Haunani writes, assert Hawaii as theirs. Both deny the ancient Hawaiian cultural and creative ground upon which, as foreigners in our country, they continue to falsify their history and their status. A decade and a half later, many are still contending with her words, even though many of us kind of take for granted the ability to talk about Hawaii as a settler colonial site. That 1997 address, it was just utterly transformative. And I don't think we've entirely dealt with all the ways that was the case. One of those who took up the critiques that Haunani offered was Candace Fujikani. If the volume Asian Settler Colonialism from Local Governance to the Habits of Everyday Life in Hawaii that she co-edited renders visible the structures of Asian settler colonialism and the privileges it offers, Candace's most recent book, Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, imagines a way not to be guided by logics of settler capitalist extraction, but by care for others and the land, predicated on abundance and forms of solidarity honed in practice, not asserted. I think, like many of us, Haunani would be astonished by this book. In her Melis address, as elsewhere, Haunani evinces what Cindy called a few weeks back her internationalism, and which Ku'aloha evoked as well. Haunani invokes in that address Chile's Pablo Neruda, Nicaragua's Daisy Zamora, Cuba's Jose Marti, Nigeria's Chinua Achebe, South Africa's Dennis Brutus, Palestinian writer Mohamed Darwish, James Baldwin, and what she says, Polynesia's own Albert Wendt. Her lists of people, of such people, are common in her writing, and they're often different, right? So her repertoire of the people she was in solidarity with across the globe was quite vast, and often included unexpected people. So at one point, I think in the late 90s, she called me up to ask if I had a copy of Jose Carlos Mariátegui's 1928 book, Seven Interpretive Essays on Peruvian Reality. Now, this is not a widely known book, or it certainly was not at the time. In fact, it was really hard to get. And I was kind of shocked because the only people I knew who knew it were the people who read it in a graduate seminar I had taken, and Latin Americanists who worked on Peru. Actually, it just was not that well known. And it's very much about the relationship to land. So because it's so hard to get, I have to admit I was a little afraid to let her have it, because I didn't want to lose the book, as we all lose books. And she could hear in my voice that I was reticent. So she said, look, I'm going to give you the book back. And when I do, we can go out to dinner and talk about it and drink Prosecco. So both of those things happened. As I mentioned, we had a reading group on Gramsci. And one of the things that is really dear to me are memories of reading with her, his work, especially the prison notebooks, and her ability to just spin out the most amazing analysis and map those ideas onto what was happening in Hawaii. I remember in particular her talking about Senate Bill 8, the one that would have restricted gathering rights, and how she thought of it in relation to the war of maneuver and the war of position. She was also somebody who was keenly aware of the way that settler colonialism makes the colonized turn against each other. And she would point out these passages over and over again in Gramsci, where you could see those kinds of tensions. When she would often say, get it, get it. So that's a kind of famous phrase that those of us who either studied with her or knew her know her to say frequently, and one that Cindy and I often kind of tease each other about. Her reading in political theory was extremely vast, and so too was the poetry that spoke to her, which again, Ku'aloha mentioned. And there was an internationalism in the kinds of poetry she was attracted to as well. Sometimes, but not often, she would call me up and read a poem that she loved. She noted how Greek poets Kavafi and Ritsos, also from an archipelagical nation, focused on light in a way that she admired, and she spoke of how difficult it is to convey the properties of light, to create in words that sense of being immersed within morning light, the different tones of night light. We once talked about Thomas McGrath's conception of strategic and tactical poetry. If you don't know who he is, don't worry, many don't. He was a North Dakota poet who was the first American poet, a communist and a labor unionist, to be translated into Russian after the Russian Revolution. So not many people knew about him, but she did. And that was kind of astonishing to me until she reminded me that she was educated just a few states away in Wisconsin. One of the last phone calls that we had was about the Turkish poet, Nahim Hikmet. I had bought her a copy of his book, Beyond the Walls, which is a compilation of his poetry, much of it written while he was in prison. She, of course, already had it. So she called me and said, give it to, I'm going to send it back, give it to a student. I already have it. And she said, do you want to know what my favorite poem is? And I said, is it on living? And she said, yes. And then she read me his famous poem on living. One part of which is, let's say we're in prison and close to 50, and we have 18 more years, say before the iron doors will open. We'll still live with the outside, with its people and animals, struggle and wind. I mean, with the outside, beyond the walls. I mean, however and wherever we are, we must live as if we will never die. I think that's how she thought of struggle as well, and how she thought of her legacy. It's also something I have noticed in her poetry as I've reread it over the last couple of weeks, that there is a kind of an ecstatic kind of quality sometimes in the poetry, a blending of time and space and an emerging with nature that isn't typical of others, but that you can also see in some of those poets that she so loved. Haunani was simply among the most brilliant people I have ever met, which is saying a lot if you know my friends. That kind of brilliance can be blinding, forcing our eyes to adjust. When I return to Haunani's work, I am always amazed by how far ahead her political thinking and poetic vision were, and also how inseparable in many ways those two things were. Discussions of legacy cannot be based solely on what an individual was or did, but should, I think, look towards what comes next. Many will be working their lifetime to catch up with her. Others, like the women you are about to hear from, among her most cherished students, I know because I've read the letters of recommendation that she wrote for them, have been working alongside her for some time, and they will make space for the generation ahead. That is a legacy worthy of Haunani-Kay Trask.
That's so beautiful. Mahalo nui loa, Laura. Brandy.
I just need to collect myself a little bit. Mahalo, mahalo, Laura. Mahalo ku'aloha. Mahalo to all of you for joining us today, and mahalo to the English department for holding this space for us to celebrate Haunani-Kay Trask. Okay. I wanted to, I guess, just start my part in this by, it's really hard to, be a woman today and to think about like all the ways that Haunani has played a role in your life, has shaped it in some form or another, has touched it. In just kind of looking back on my life, I know that, I have really, much of my life was spent actually, I can see now looking back, being sort of an asteroid orbiting around her planet, really. And so I'm just going to share a little bit of that. And, by way of kind of showing how much of her work, her poetry, her activism, her ano really kind of shaped me as a poet, kumu scholar myself. So my first actual introduction to Haunani-Kay Trask was actually seeing her on the news when I was in high school. So this was in 1993. I was a junior, a boarder at Kamehameha, Kapalama. It was before the Maui campus was built, so I was a boarder. And I happened to be home. It was a long weekend. And so in 1993, during her famous speech, for the centennial of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the famous speech that we all kind of quote from today, it's become a rallying cry where she yelled, "We are not Americans, we are not Americans, we will die as Hawaiians, we will never be Americans," right? Amongst so many other just amazing and just electrifying things that she said in that moment. I watched her on the news, and of course, and while I was on Maui, and it was framed by Joe Moore, who's many of you know, who've been a part of Hawaii for a long time, and he's still going as a news anchorman. But Joe Moore, was the person who was reporting on Haunani giving this speech, and that Channel 2 News had only sort of given this clip of Haunani yelling, "We are not American." It was one of those things where sometimes news is just sort of like in the background and playing, and you're getting dinner together and all this stuff, and this was the case for me. And as soon as I heard her voice, it was like a spell being broken. It was really amazing. And it didn't matter that Joe Moore was, sharing his usual kind of vicious colonial diatribe kind of surrounding it. I was only hearing her. And it was like her words, even in that short clip, had broken this spell and had really sort of clearly cut through all the noise and articulated a truth that I had in me that I didn't know how to articulate myself. And so that was my first just sort of knowing of Haunani. So this is like when I was maybe even like sort of cosmic dust, not even quite an asteroid quite yet. So that then later led to, and I can really appreciate this now, having been a teacher at Kamehameha for just a couple of years, that actually led to Kamehameha schools really having a focused discussion about sovereignty, really highlighting Hawaiian history, especially around the overthrow. And that came in large part because of Haunani's activism and her teaching. And the song contest that year was called E Ola Mau E Kalahui, which is pretty huge for Kamehameha during that time. This is in 93, just to remind you. And I'm also proud because my class actually won that year for singing Harry Kunihi Mitchell's Mele no Kaho'olawe. And that year though was kind of a defining year for all of us Hawaiians, really. It was like it was amazing to kind of be just even in a place like Song Contest, where we were feeling our political identity perhaps for the first time. And that was really where I mahalo nui Haunani forever for just sort of opening that political consciousness right in that moment, for me and for so many other people. So later on, I read her poetry and From a Native Daughter as an undergraduate at Whittier College, and then again as a poetry MFA student. While I was getting my poetry MFA, one of my teachers, a person who had grown up in Hawaii and was very openly intimidated by Haunani-Kay Trask, he asked me to read From a Native Daughter and to examine the evidence behind it. So I read it. While I could not find the scholarly evidence that, or as much of the statistics that I think he and other academics perhaps demanded as part of the academy as a colonial institution, that of course Haunani also takes to task in that work. I read her life experiences, you know, her astute analysis, and I found that I was actually the evidence, just as she was. And that really made all the difference to me, you know. So she was, I also felt like in those moments, I could see her, like she was willing to be angry. She was willing to be unapologetic, impolite, assertive, truthful, brave, and everything that I was really afraid to be at that time, you know. And at that time I was kind of in my mid-20s, trying to find myself, you know, figuring out what I wanted to be, what I wanted to do with my life. And she continued to be that planet that I was just sort of drawn to and gravitated towards, kind of orbiting around. And keep in mind, during that time, this was amidst all the rampant rhetoric of reverse racism. This is when there was John Doe v. Kamehameha schools, Rice v. Cayetano, all of that deemed Hawaiians and Hawaiian serving organizations racist. And it felt like at that time, a concerted legal effort to continually dismantle whatever we had built and whatever was there to help us. And so there she was again in these moments to provide her analysis and to kind of bravely stand against that and give us the language to kind of fight. Later, I was on a Fulbright in Aotearoa, and there I got to work with Albert Wendt, Reina Faitiri, Witi Ihimaira, Robert Sullivan, and all of them were friends of hers, knew her really well, and connected with her work via being in Aotearoa amongst all of her friends. I remember at the time they were all like, "You haven't met Haunani? What's happening?" You know, and so forward the next year, I ended up working for a dysfunctional Hawaiian organization that I will not name, but is still in existence. That was at the time led by Hawaiian women who were raised in Alaska and supported the Akaka bill, and supported a distinct form of federal recognition. But those two were so obviously also intimidated by Haunani and would often actually talk about, you know, what it would be like if she showed up at a particular event. And just sort of hearing that and being a part of that dysfunction and just sort of hearing like kind of how intimidated they were really made me feel like, okay, there are so many signs in my life that are really like, go toward that planet that is Haunani-Kay Trask. Go, go, go. So finally, I became a student at UH, a PhD student in English, and took her class. And the class was on revolutionaries. Okay, just the dream class anybody could take with someone like Haunani-Kay Trask. And we looked at colonialism and imperialism as international struggle against European and American and white supremacy, right? We read Rigoberta Menchú, Nawal el-Saadawi, Malcolm X, Che Guevara, Michael Collins, Frantz Fanon, Nelson Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, and we watched Act of War, the film that she got funding for and helped shape, and she would tell us like, yeah, it's pretty funny, actually. We applied for this federal grant, and they gave us money to make 5 films that really tell the news or tell the true history of Hawaii and its relationship to the United States. And she's like, and you better believe we used all of that and we made it happen. So she was like showing us Act of War, and we watched that alongside the Battle of Algiers, and talked about like what it means to create revolution, what it means to kind of look at like actively dissenting, protesting, and the work that can happen from activism and from speaking truth in this way, right? So I'll always be grateful to her for that. Following that, I asked her as a beginning poet blurb my book eventually. And I still remember being so just kind of scared and afraid to approach her about it. But then pretty similar to how Ku'aloha said, like, oh, I can't just like back down. Like, here's this amazing, amazing kumu that I had. And so it felt often like, just kind of going to her and being like, would you blurb my book, please? And, she did. And I still have this just really beautiful memory of her reading her blurb to me out loud. And I remember just crying in front of her, which is something that you actually don't tend to do very much in front of Haunani-Kay, because she will call you out on it too. But I think in that moment, she was actually kind of accepting of it and was really sweet about it. So anyway, being a poet, scholar, kumu, activist, a slyly reproductive mother, in her wake, I'm teaching my anti-colonial art and activism class now, teaching her work alongside other activists and artists dedicated to anti-colonial movements, reading her following Lili'u's mele, reading about the garden of Uluhai Malama, the Mo'olelo of the Queen's imprisonment, and discussing the relationship between prisons and colonialism, and thus the importance of supporting prison abolition as an anti-colonial movement. But then seeing her poems, her scholarship, her essays, including writing in captivity and decolonizing Hawaiian literature, and her speeches urging us to be more political. Oh, gosh, putting that into conversation has been amazing. And, after her, we've read James Baldwin, discussed his art, intellectualism, and activism, the ways we might see how Notes of a Native Son may have influenced her from a Native daughter. We've read Audre Lorde, discussing Lorde's work against silencing, her emphasis on anger and the erotic as productive sources of knowledge and liberation, and have talked about Haunani's emphasis on rage and rapture as part of that too. We've also read the work of friends of hers like Dana Noone Hall and Joy Harjo. And all these folks, by the way, talk about their own political consciousness also being shaped by Malcolm X, as Haunani's was. And I believe she was listening to his 1964 speech, Ballot or the Bullet, as she drove to Iolani Palace to make that famous speech in 1993, nearly 30 years later. So I see Haunani's work as a mele ho'ala. She was able to move us decades ahead as a force of hulihia, as a mana hulihia herself. She was a revolutionary, a change maker. And change happens, especially anti-colonial, decolonial change, it happens often incrementally and slowly. But Haunani was really able to push us forward so many years ahead, decades and decades ahead. So, it's my kuleana to continue that work, linking decolonial analysis with art and activism, just as she did. And it's my kuleana, my privilege as an Oiwi Kumu now and a poet to be part of that continuum of hulihia. And as Haunani is now all around us, just like decolonization, as she famously writes, and she has gone into our sovereign sons, drunk on the mana of Hawaii. And that's from Into Our Light, I Will Go Forever, the final poem of her brilliant second book, Night is a Sharkskin Draw. So yeah, mahalo for bearing with me. And again, mahalo nui e kumu makamai Haunani Trask. Mahalo.
Mahalo nui loa, Brandy. And as long as I've known all of you, I'm learning so much more. And this to me is what is really special about all the different sharing that's been going on. So No'u, when you're ready.
you speak about Pele, you speak about women, and you speak about your slyly reproductive, one of my favorite.
Can everyone hear? Everyone can hear? Okay.
Oh, good. And how does, how much of your poetry reflects that spirit of, perhaps not feminism, but Manoa English?
Yeah, I can't write a poem without thinking of my voice as being predominantly female. There's never any possibility, even when I'm not conscious of it, it's there. And so, and I think that's good because women need that. Women, younger women need older women that just write about what we think. Well, first of all, men are writing more than women. So they write about women in a sexual way that I don't particularly like and do I think is accurate. So I think that the idea that women should steer away from issues like sex. It's just the opposite. Hawaiian women were so intensely sexual. What we need to do is bring all of that back and just throw it in. Now, I happen to like to write in terms of metaphor, but you don't have to. You could just write declarative sentences. People would try to find things in my poems that weren't there. And I thought, gee, I'm getting so clever, they can't figure out what the damn thing is about. There's a poem called You Will Be Undarkened by Me. And they all thought it was about race. I said, no. I thought there's too much metaphor over here, they don't get it, you know?
Deeply here, people.
Yeah, deeply. Undarkened isn't just race, okay? But to me, that's what poetry is. It's metaphor. I don't like to write declarative sentences because that's what all my essays are. That's the other part of my life is metaphor. So why do you tell me to write it this way? I don't want to write it that way.
Do you think Native Hawaiian writers have a special relationship with metaphor?
Absolutely. Everything we say and do is metaphor. Everything. And I keep telling my students, you're on the right path.
So a Wahine comes up to you and she's a Native Hawaiian woman and she wants to be a writer. And she asks advice. What advice would you give her?
Write every chance you get. Never, never, never walk around without a book and a pen. And get a book that's like my little black one there that you can stuff in your bag. Don't get some big thing like this because you'll leave it at home. And just walk around and carry it with you, because what happens to most poets is that they're inspired by something, by the rustling of the leaves, by the beautiful sky, by something someone says, by a smell. Somebody walks by you and the smell comes back 25 years ago when you picked mangoes. And you've got to have that little book so you can read them.
For the record, I still carry a little black book. Nearly a year before retiring, Haunani-Kay Trask spoke with me in her office at the Kamakakuokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies. Ku'aloha ho'omanawanui set an interview assignment in a literature course I was enrolled in, and I asked Haunani if she would be willing to talk story. At that point, I was taking my second course with her. She generously agreed, and our interview later inspired my 2012 MA project, which mapped a literary mo'oku auho between Haunani, Ku'aloha, and myself. As Haunani and I settled in for our interview in her office at Kamakakuokalani, her on the couch, me on a chair near her desk, Haunani stroked her hair and asked me, "Do you want to write literature?" I was an Oiwi, freshly returned from New York University, and years of thinking success meant I had to leave home and stay away. I was a closeted lesbian, and I was a poet, too afraid to say out loud, "I want to write a book of poems," and something inside me says it matters. But you're the only one that seems to agree with me. She asked me, "Do you want to write literature?" Her long, elegant fingers ran down the back of her head. as she twisted and twisted her silver hair, securing at last a strong bun with a koa hairpiece. Words from her poem, Woman, seemed to stream between us. Waiting for you, your sullen blood, your silver eye, your fanged desire to be raw, swift, and deadly. Do you want to write literature? I watched her skillful fingers, mumbled something about poetry in graduate school. That's fantastic, she responded, her hands clapping in exclamation. What do you write? I was astonished, almost breathless, how Haunani-Kay Trask cared about what I wrote. We cannot underestimate the power of telling a student we care about them. I struggled to answer Haunani's question that afternoon in 2009, but I listened to her stories, to her advice. I got to hear her laugh and spit barb after barb at settler colonialism, at shitty educators and patriarchy. She read me a poem. I listened with everything inside me. I continue to listen to her. Today, I want to read the poem that brought me back home. The poem that brought me to every classroom of Haunani-Kay Trask. The poem that is making my first book of poems possible. I want to uplift Haunani with all of you by reading her poem, Sons. Your grandmother said about your grandfather, I gave him 3 sons. Yesterday, a man told me to give him trust. Is trust like a son? Or less, not being generative, phallic, or immortal? Did she tell me about her giving in pride or warning? But I have no sons to give, no line of immortality. I am slyly reproductive. Ideas, books, history, politics, reproducing the rope of resistance for unborn generations. But sons are not so earthbound. They soar beyond, somewhere with a woman's trust in their fists. And I stay behind, weaving fine baskets of resilience to carry our daughters in. Haunani, you taught me how to choose defiance. When I first read Sons, I was young, closeted, and playing house. And that challenge to be slyly reproductive, what a gauntlet, what permission. I live and die by those lines some days because it is 2021, more than 25 years since you wrote that poem, and I and other queer Oiwi Wahine like me are still deemed not good enough by some of our own people if we do not bear biological children, fall in love, and make family the way other people do. So I could talk about sons until the cows come home. I will write about sons until I turn into the moon. I will teach sons until daughters, mahu, trans, non-binary, lesbians, queer, and intersectional feminist children of your legacy know the air of enough is us. There is more than one way to ho'oululahui. In fact, let us continue to reflect on what lahui means to us. Let us continue to be slyly reproductive. Haunani, you taught me that aloha is rage and rapture. Defiance and desire were seeds in your hands. and I would follow your fingers into the lepo again and again and again. Mahalo nui loa.
Thank you, everybody. I had Kualoha, and I had arranged that I would handle the Q&A. Just kind of like, or I'm sure Kualoha is going to. I'm just making sure that I recognize people. So Kualoha, why don't you take it away, and I'll keep an eye on making sure that we recognize people who want to speak or ask questions. And I think, you know, there's so many of us here. I think just so that I'm able to keep the order, if you would raise your hand, I mean, like, you not raise your hand, but use the raise hand function, then it automatically moves you to the front of my screen. And that way I can be sure that I'm attending to everybody. Kualoha, are you here?
I am here.
Okay, all right, there you go. Okay,
What would you like me to do?
should we just go to, well, I was gonna ask you, what would you like to do? So,
Oh, well, we can open up for
okay,
questions and comments. And all I'd like to say while people gather their thoughts is that any number of the people that joined us today could have been on this panel and have so much to share, I know. And like I said, this is just like one small, tiny snippet of many other beautiful tributes and writing and sharing that has happened and that will continue to happen. So mahalo nui to all of you who came today to spend time with us. And I see so many more of Haunani students, my students, all of your students, No'u and Brandy and others. And as Brandy said, she's here, absolutely here. So, and if anybody wants to share anything on chat, as people have been doing, or as Shankar said, the raise hand screen would be fine too. So mahalo. And if Laura or Brandy or No'u wanna add any additional comments as well.
maybe while people are waiting, maybe they're gathering their thoughts. My students, a couple of my students are here too, you know, and so I was very pleased to see that. And as it happens, I have been teaching Haunani's work this semester, both her poetry and her criticism. And what was really kind of has been important to me about her work is something that I try to learn from is that she's not limited by genre, right? I mean, she's like, okay, can do this, will do this, and we'll do this amazingly. And I think that really came out for me in the panel. I mean, all the different ways in which all of you talked about Haunani in terms of not only her ideas, but her sort of desire and ability to work across genres, because she's an amazing poet and she's an amazing intellectual and an amazing critic. So, you know, I was teaching decolonizing Hawaiian literature, and a few weeks before that, we read her poetry, and it was amazing to be able to tell students, you know, look, that's the poet, and this is the critic and the intellectual. What's the connection, and how do we do that? And not many writers are able to do that. So that's something that I've always taken away from Haunani. But I'm still waiting to see if people have other things to offer or questions for the panelists.
So Haunani loved metaphor. So if you're too hila to ask a question, maybe, you know, Haunani is metaphor game in the chat. You know what I'm saying? Free write. Haunani is a mountain. Haunani is the Mahealani moon. Haunani is. We could definitely archive that and do something with it, but we could also just share it with each other. She is metaphor queen after all.
Just fast, and if I can say something without crying. Right? Mahalo to all. all of you for sharing her. I'm just beyond. I got it. What is the word for when you want to hug but cannot because of Zoom? That's where I'm at with you. And I want, no, please, if you can email your poem. Since the Hawaiian philosophy class started, I started with her words, always, and will always start with her words. And I begin with sons, because there's no sons, but look, I'm right here. And then I go into Nalani McDougall's The Second Gift. And I would like to, at the next iteration of the class, know if I could borrow your poem, as the words just begin, this idea of this mo'o, of generations of change and of wonder and of beauty and rage and rapture. Mahalo for that. Yeah, so big hugs, folks. Love you, Choke. Love her. Just mahalo.
Mahalo. Will do, will do.
Well, if I may say something, I am Luciano Minervi. I was not a student of Haunani, but I was a colleague. And I didn't know her on this beautiful aspect of poetry and engagement. But I've been working with her at something else much more practical. A project that we were involved with was that they resulted in the 1989 Hawaii Declaration of the Hawaii Ecumenical Coalition on Tourism Conference. And our document was Tourism in Hawaii, its impact on Native Hawaiian, and the challenge to the churches. And both Haunani and her terrific sister were involved in doing this study, connecting with international ecumenical groups from Thailand, and had the courage to organize this conference that was engaging the power that be here in Hawaii, the tourist machine, and try to ask help from the local church institutions. And it was her involvement and her initiative in starting this kind of project. I don't know if I'm trying to share the screen here. I don't know how to do it. Well, forget it. I can send it to you, the declaration. But basically, I saw Haunani here instead through the help of people like me, crossing border and try to reach the church's institution here and get them to engage in confronting the socioeconomic and cultural condition of Hawaiian back in 1989. And in that conference, we learned about the bishop in California apologizing to the American Indian. And so we said, well, if they did it over there, let's do it over here. Oh, is it possible? But somehow we engaged them, and the United Church of Christ actually agreed to have an apology locally here on what the Boston missionary started to do and so on. A representative of the Catholic Church didn't feel that they had to apologize. But anyway, I think that was the beginning trial that led rehearsal, that led then a US Congress to apologize to the Native Hawaiian, even if there was no money, no reparation involved. So that has been my experience with her to see how she would be willing, in spite of all the rage and the rapture defiance, engage practically and politically through people, intermediary like me, to basically engage at the churches. And so I remember she told me, I don't go to talk to them, you go to talk to the bishop. So I had to take my Italian diplomatic religious background and go and talk to the Catholic Church to obtain the venue in St. Stephen Monastery here to have the conference. That was an international conference. And then go and talk to the bishop of the United Church of Christ. I was kind of concerned about talking about engaging in this work. I was lucky. This bishop was an American Indian. I didn't have to explain too much. He allowed his clergy of the local church here, Church of the Crossroad, to participate. So basically, that's what we did. I remember that I typed this document with both Trask sister behind me, telling me what to put in the computer. Thank you very much.
You know, if I could share for a moment, following up what you just said, one of my most vivid and pivotal moments of her changing my life and my thinking was during this time. I grew up in the UCC church, the Hawaiian church on Kauai, and this was when there were bones being unearthed. I think it was Honokohua in Maui in the late 80s. And one day in class, she said, just imagine if we went to Central Union Church and we started digging up missionary bones. How would they feel about that? And here I was, the good little 20-year-old Christian girl who was like, oh my God, we can't do that. We can't do that. Bing! That was her point. And it changed my entire life and just completely was the earthquake that toppled my foundation before that day and that class and ever since. And that was that time that you were working with her, and that was all happening, and it was very significant, going back to that early time, and you know, all the other cases that have come forward since then about burials and such, and the different activism that's continued. And now, of course, Kauai Ha'o Church, which has lost my kupuna Evie in all of their digging, and now they've lost all their income from Japanese weddings who don't, even before COVID, because they don't believe in the idea of open graves. And so there's a whole bunch of what do we say, hoka, that has come from all the pilau stuff the churches have been doing. So anyways, mahalo for sharing that story. That takes me back.
Thank you. There is actually another one that was the fight for the Hawaiian Study building, that the university didn't want to do it. And when they couldn't oppose that construction anymore, the planner, and I am a planner, so that's why I know, to be mean to the Hawaiian, decided, you want the building? Okay, the building is going to go in the loi, because we need a parking lot for the campus. And that is when I started to collaborate with the Hawaiian Study and document and testify in the Senate about the fact that the Maori had a beautiful Maori building in their university in Auckland, and UH didn't have it one, I didn't want one. And the highlight for me was to take the courage and go to testify at the Senate for the Hawaiian building. And who was testify in front of me against, if not my boss, the Italian president of the University of Hawaii, President Simone. And he was so mad because my testimony was better than his, because I had a visual documentation of the Maori building in the University of Auckland. And he didn't have anything except that he didn't want the building. And the Senate chair was in Hawaiian, Malama Salomon. So that was a satisfaction I got to collaborate with Haunani-Kay. But then she passed me to Kekuni, because Kekuni, he was the chairman eventually for this building committee and was really mistreated by the university administration. And that's why I was just a committee member, but kind of supporting him. And so I'm so happy now to see that there is this building that is ceremonially designed and the law is there, happy and healthy. Mahalo.
Thank you. We are pretty much out of time, and this has been an amazing conversation. So I want to thank everybody, and I will leave the Zoom on for a while if people want to just kind of like hang around and talk to one another. I've already had my tea. I'm okay with that. So, you know, I'll leave the Zoom on, but thank you for coming. This has been an amazing panel, and it's been recorded. And yes, I will save the chat. And so thank you again for everybody, for Koloha, to Laura, to Brandy, and to Noe for sharing their not only their remembrances of Haunani, which was very much there, but their sort of insights into her work and her legacy. I think both things really came out really well. Koloha, did you want to, as the chair of the panel, did you want to say anything before we call the meeting concluded?
Just mahalo nui loa to my wonderful co-panelist. It's been so awesome to know you all and work with you in different ways over the years, and also know how much aloha you've all had and your special relationships with Haunani as well. And mahalo nui loa to everyone else who came today and who represent so many parts of Haunani's teaching and friendship and mentorship. And I know you all have your own stories. I've heard some of them in different tributes in different places. And you know, I really believe, right, that collectively we carry forth all this important work in all the many ways. So mahalo nui loa kako.
Thank you, everybody. I'll leave the Zoom on, but thank you for coming.
Will there be a recording available later?
It is being recorded, and I'll make sure to save it. I'm not the most technically adept person with that, but so I will consult people who know more about what to do with the recording, but we are recording it, yes.
So where can I get it?
I'm not sure what's going to happen with it, so why don't you write to Enghai, ENGHI at hawaii.edu, and just express your interest in the recording. And if and when it becomes ready, we'll make sure that we let you know how to get it.
Okay, what was the email address?
Enghai, that's ENGHI at hawaii.edu.
ENGHI, okay.
At hawaii.edu, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Laura. That was great. That was very good, very moving. And
this is a really thank you so much for putting this together, you and Kualoha, because, you know, it's just important for people to come together.
I know, and to know her legacy. I mean, I thought you really did an amazing job of bringing out her third worldist sensibilities, you know, which was very much part of what she was as well.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah. Yeah, but you know, her students, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess. Okay. I'm gonna go. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks again.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.